Hey everyone, before we start the episode, just a quick note. We recorded this episode with Dr. Karsina before the release of the updated ethics code from the BACB. That came out at about the end of December, and we recorded this a little bit before the sort of, end December break. So while I think the episode still covers a lot of important topics related to what should an ethics code be, what should be in an ethics code, it does make reference to the current and soon to be old compliance code. So when you hear us refer to code numbers and values, we're looking at the old code, not the one that was just released to be in place as of next January. So with that out of the way, we hope you enjoy our great debate. Hey everybody, welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
And every week on this show, we discuss an important topic in the annals of behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. And this week is a very important topic. We are talking all about ethics. And we're not just talking about any old ethics. We're going to have a great debate. We're going to have a team versus team debate on a topic related to the BACB ethics code. But we can't do that with only three of us because that would be unfair teams. So I brought in a ringer. I have special guest joining us again, Dr. Alan Karsina. Alan, thank you so much for joining my team to help me win this debate.
Hi, everybody. Great to see you again.
So, Alan, you joined us way back when, and you talked with us all about choice. So,
back in episode 9.
Episode 9, we were in the single digits.
Episode 153.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
We are so glad to have you back. But again, some people might not have listened to the show since the very first year we did it. So would you mind giving everyone a little bit of background information on who you are and all of your bona fides to talk all about ethics and wipe the floor with the competition here?
Well, I like how you've hyped me up, but I'll give just a brief background. I'm Director of Professional Development at the New England Center for Children, where I actually met all of you once upon a time. I'm an adjunct faculty at Western New England University and also at Regis. In both those universities, I teach an ethics course. Have been on and off for quite a while now. So it's a topic I love, and I can't wait to get into this and talk to you all about it.
Alan actually taught our ethics class.
He taught my ethics
me
class.
Me and Jackie.
In my undergraduate. I'm just kidding, my graduate.
Yeah, I didn't think there was your undergraduate, but
I was a very smart undergraduate.
yeah, we don't go back that far.
There are so many things to talk about when we talk about ethics, but in our case, we are going to have a pretty, I don't want to say too narrow a focus, but a focus on specifically the BACB code. We'll be discussing 2 articles related to the ethics code. And of course, since these 2 articles, one is an initial thought piece on the ethics code, and then the other is a response from the BACB. Hey, you know what? They lend themselves really well to this debate. So the 2 articles that we will mainly be discussing tonight are Guidance or Compliance? What makes an ethical behavior analyst? By Rosenberg and Schwartz from Behavior Analysis in Practice. When was that? 2018. And then we'll also be talking about, 2019. It was online first in 2018. I hate when they do that. It makes it very hard to find the dates. And then the BACB's follow-up by Sellers, Carr, and Nosik. We've got on the BACB's ethics requirements, a response to Rosenberg and Schwartz 2019. But that article was written in 2020.
Oh, snap.
So in this corner, in one corner, in the Jackie and Diana's corner, they are going to be making a proposition statement. But P.S., they're on the side of Rosenberg and Schwartz, whereas Alan and I are on the side of the BACB. And again, this may or may not reflect sort of our overall feelings on these articles. These are just the sides we'll be debating. And then at the end, we'll come back and we'll sort of talk about any other thoughts we have. Because I think in terms of ethics, it's a bad idea to sort of pick sides in such a way that you couldn't see a positive in both articles.
Oh, do you?
I do.
I'm going to use that piece of information.
Oh, no. You're going to throw me under the bus.
Diana just had her pen and she wrote that down.
Oh, yeah. I should have my pad of paper so I can take notes, tear apart your arguments later. So in the interest of debate, because, Alan, this was sort of your idea. It's like, we should do a debate between these two. We decided, well, let's get a little more formal with it. So while this will overall take the form of one of our episodes, we thought, let's put a little bit of old parliamentary structure in terms of the debate. Jackie and Diana will be considered the affirmative if we look at debating rules. And then Alan and I will be the opposition. And we'll be a little bit more structured in that we'll sort of take turns in terms of making statements. So Jackie and Diana will be starting, followed by our side's opening statements. Then we'll do a little bit of a back and forth questioning and debating, and then we'll end with a kind of a final set of thoughts. So not super formal in that regard. Like, I think we had like exact timetables. We're not going to be following anything like that. So if you're pulling out your Queen's rules of debate, don't.
Rules? There are no rules.
Yeah, please don't write in and tell us how we failed at our British parliamentary style or anything like that, because we're just trying to give a little bit of structure just to make it a bit more fun. Dinah is really happy. She loves debating. If you've listened to the show, you know that is her favorite thing in the world.
I'm trying to laugh it off here, but I'm actually about to throw up because I hate debate.
It's also hilarious. I also hate debating, which makes our team the hater debaters.
We concede, okay?
We did it. We did it, Alan. We won. We scared them.
And yet, when I said, do we really want to debate? You were like, yes,
of course we need to debate.
So,
well, it's the best way to talk about these articles, I think.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah,
Worst case scenario, you can let students, future students, BACB, new practitioners say, you know what, the best way to learn about how to talk about something complicated like ethics is to put yourself out there on a recording that will be there for the rest of time,
eternity, so
that everyone can see how many mistakes you made. Because that's real bravery when it comes to
Rob.
talking ethics.
That really helps.
Oh, I'm saying that for myself too. I mean, come on. I ain't no professor of ethics. All right. Well, with all that preamble out of the way, let's get into it. Let's get into the great ethics debate of 2021, I think, when this comes out, right? It gets tough when we start recording around the new year. All right. So let's begin, Jackie and Diana, with your proposition statement. You have the floor. I will not actually time you, but pretend there is a ticking clock and someone is going to yell at you if you go over it.
So I want you to know that I was in the court thing that you call when you're in the court thing.
Is this your debate, or is this your opening statement, or are you just telling me?
I just wanted to tell you my background of debate.
Okay.
I can't remember what it's called, though. I'll remember later.
Wait, what?
Model UN?
No. It's like when you're pretending to be a lawyer.
Club.
You're pretending to be a lawyer. Mock trial. I was in mock trial. And I said thingamajig, and I lost.
That was the reason you lost?
No, I probably just was really bad at it. Just giving you, I've had a lot of experience debating. JK, I have not. But our proposition statement comes from the Rosenberg and Schwartz article, which says that the rule-based decision-making model that the current BACB ethical code is based on is both too constrictive and inflexible to best serve the practitioners and recipients of behavior analytics services. And there are a few reasons why we feel very strongly about this. We recognize that there needs to be an ethical code because we are in a very young profession. And as Rosenberg and Schwartz points out, that we have grown astronomically in the last 10 years, right? So we've gone from, just a few BCBAs ever to now over 25,000 BCBAs as of 2014. And prior to this new ethical code, prior to 2016, I guess, the ethical guidelines were that. They were guidelines on how we as practitioners should help inform our practice. But now, as of 2016, these are no longer guidelines. They're now a code. That means that they're now enforceable. So if anyone is acting in a way that might be not quite in line with the ethical code, it is now enforceable by the BACB and their legal team. It's called deontological ethics, right? When we're looking at rule-based ethics. These rules should tell behavior analysts how to act ethically in all situations. And we, as the affirmative, are going to argue that this code doesn't allow us to act ethically in all situations. Yeah, so our ethical guidelines, or the code as it is now, we feel is fairly constrictive in that it attempts to apply the rule to all situations, no matter any nuance that's happening in that situation. And, let's be honest, behavior analysts love applying rules to situations, right? And so it's really constrictive because what we found when we read the Rosenberg and Schwartz article is that there's 3 things that we've noticed that are being a little bit inflexible when we're talking about this code. So there's some gray areas that we need to consider when we're providing high quality real life care to our clients and in situations where we're acting with other professionals and other behavior analysts. So some things can't be taken into account through the code, such as culture in this code, for instance. And so we wanted to talk about how the code is fairly constrictive in these 3 ways. When we're talking about context, when we're talking about 2 or more rules conflicting in the code, and when we're talking about cultural considerations. And although the BACB ethical code does say in one of the ethical codes, 105, about cultural considerations, that's the only mention of it in the code. So we feel like that is something that needs to be taken into consideration. Diana?
Oh, why, thank you, Jackie. Yeah, so to build on what Jackie's saying, I think that it's critical that we as behavior analysts are taught not just a set of rules to follow, but a way in which to interpret the complex situations that we encounter in our clinical practice according to an overall set of ethical standards, which can be flexible enough to apply in various situations. And I feel that the way that the code is currently set up makes it such that it can be inflexible to many of those gray areas that we often encounter when we're attempting to provide real life care to clients in a social services setting and their families. To expand upon those situations that Jackie was discussing, in which we feel that the ethics code as it currently stands is sort of less than robust. She noted that there are situations where the context of the ethical dilemmas may seem to argue against the rules that are in place. And I think we'll hopefully have time later to sort of embellish upon that and note that there are some contextual situations in which one might make an interpretation of the code in a way that may ultimately be challenging or prohibitive to the overall relationship that you're attempting to establish with your client. There are also times where 2 or more rules may conflict with one another, rules being the statements within the ethical code. And in these situations, you're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place as far as attempting to follow the rules that are laid out by the code. So if you're focused specifically on this type of rule following behavior, then you may be stuck in a situation where you really can't sort of find your way out, right? And the example that they provided in Rosenberg and Schwartz was the classic social rules of be kind and be honest are rules that we attempt to follow as part of our standard sort of moral code, but they can at times be at odds with one another. And you basically have to pick which one you're going to follow. And there are other examples like that within the behavior analytic ethics code as well.
I love their example there. It's like, your friend gets a really bad haircut. Do you tell them?
I know. I thought about it. I was like, how would I respond to that? I'd be like, well, do you like it?
Yeah. Wow. Different.
And then finally, and there's so much to say on this component here, is that there are cultural considerations that are not necessarily taken into account the way that the code is currently written. Those cultural considerations can be listed across a wide variety of situations, which can include issues related to families or clients that are part of a different culture than yourself, concerns that one might have regarding your overall caseload capacity as well. I sort of been into this area. And then increasingly, so I think we need to be considering, and more people are, considerations for a neurodiverse versus neurotypical population and our own experience and perspectives with regard to that. So all of those considerations could get you into some murky territory with regard to the code, and the code doesn't help you find a way out of that with the way that it's currently written.
All right. Well, thank you, Jackie, and thank you, and Diana. So now we have Dr. Alan Karsina as the opposition statement, their opening statements.
Well, thank you, Jackie and Diana. Those were excellent points that you made. Just as a refresher, the proposition before us is that the rules-based decision-making model that the current BACB ethical code is based on is both too constrictive and inflexible to best serve the practitioners and recipients of behavior analytic services. We will show that this proposition is fundamentally flawed on at least 4 counts. First, all ethical codes meant to guide practitioner behavior must be based on rules, and these rules must be enforced for the code to have its intended effects. Although the subtleties of this point can be argued, we believe its premise cannot be. As behavior analysts, we more than anyone should understand the role of consequences in determining behavior. It is for this reason that all regulated helping professions have similar codes and enforcement procedures as the BACB does, as noted by Sellers and colleagues. Second, we propose that any code, whether based on enforceable rules or guidelines, and I'm doing the quotes, but your audience can't see that, depends on the moral will and the moral skill of its practitioners to ensure the highest standard of ethical behavior. Barry Schwartz makes this case very eloquently in his TED Talk, Our Loss of Wisdom. In this talk, Barry makes a strong case against over-reliance on rules. He points out that rules can prevent the worst cases of ethical behavior from occurring, but he also points out that a rigid reliance upon following these rules can result in less than optimal outcomes. Probably sounds like I'm arguing your case at this point, but stick with me for just a little bit longer. In his TED Talk, he argues that people must have both the moral will, that is knowing what is right and wanting to do what is right, and the moral skill, which is knowing when and how to implement a rule and when to bend it in order to behave ethically. However, and this is where we diverge from your viewpoint, the problem isn't that we have rules and that these rules are enforced. The problem lies in deficiencies in our moral will and or skill. The way to address these deficiencies is through training and mentoring. And we contend that the ethical content in the coursework, right, the full course in ethics that everyone's required to take before they can even sit for the exam, the supervision requirements, and then the continuing education requirements for ethics that all BCBAs have once they get their certification, all of these things combined, when paired with a clear set of rules, set the groundwork for ethical practitioners. And further, and this is a point that we'll develop later, we believe that without these clear enforceable rules, subjective interpretations of situations make it more likely, not less, that unethical behavior will occur. Third, we believe, along with Sellers and colleagues, that this proposition too narrowly focuses on one function of ethical codes at the expense of others. It is true that our ethical code is designed to guide practitioner behavior. However, it's also designed to protect both their practitioners and their clients, and really also the profession. In order to provide these protective functions, the code must provide both clear rules and due process. As no set of rules covers all possible contexts, codes must be accompanied with procedures for fairly evaluating each case and identifying appropriate actions. On their website, the BACB reviews how allegations are handled, what evidence is required for an allegation to proceed, how the alleged violators are notified, timelines they have for responding and for presenting their case, how these allegations are then resolved. These procedures, along with the involvement of other relevant bodies, such as state licensing boards, are intended to ensure that the maximum protection of the clients and also of the practitioner. Actions that may result from allegations include both educational actions, such as receiving additional training on a topic, and disciplinary actions, which may include suspension or even removal of certification for particularly egregious violations. It is important to note, as Sellers and colleagues point out, even when the title of the code included the word guidance or guidelines, this did not mean that the provisions were not to be followed, right? Or that there was no consequences for failure to comply with the code. This is not the case. Fourth, we contend that the limitations of the current code have been misrepresented and exaggerated. Rosenberg and Schwartz have identified 3 limitations, as you, Jackie and Diane, as you both pointed out. Briefly, these are that context sometimes matters, the rules can conflict with one another, and also that culture always matters. These are excellent points, and Rosenberg and Schwartz have provided a valuable contribution in recognizing and discussing these points. However, We believe that these limitations are not unique to the current code and that they can be handled by the current code. Does context sometimes matter? Of course it does. Bailey and Birch's Ethics for Behavior Analysts, which is a textbook that is widely used to teach ethics, is full of examples taken from real life in which the context of the situation is taken into account in resolving the issue. Step 3 of Bailey and Birch's decision-making model starts with identifying all of the relevant, unique circumstances of the issues and then outline contingency plans factoring in these circumstances. Do the rules sometimes conflict? Indeed, they do. This is also true of all codes. One thing I love about the Belmont report is that, it's a pretty brief document. It's only 3 principles, but yet written right into that document is that these 3 main principles are going to conflict and that we need to be able to deal with that when it happens. It doesn't provide how in the code, but it lets us know it'll happen. And even the principles themselves, the provisions within them, there will be conflicts there sometimes. And that's just part of life. That's why it's not only necessary to have a code, but to provide training and guidance on how to interpret and follow the code, and to provide resources such as John Bailey's Ethics Hotline for practitioners, which I hope we get back to the Ethics Hotline because it's a very, very valuable resource. So along with scholars and colleagues, or as scholars and colleagues note, sometimes these conflicts can lead to a resolution, right? So Rosenberg and Schwartz bring up a situation where a behavior analyst may be going through a difficult time, such as a very difficult divorce. And according to 105F, behavior analyst has things that impact their work. They should not be providing services. And yet 104C says that the behavior analyst has the obligation to always provide high quality services. These rules seem to conflict in this situation. However, as Seller and colleagues point out, this could actually lead to a resolution, knowing that you have an obligation to provide high quality services to your clients, and yet also knowing that you're currently in a situation where you can't do that might then lead you to find a colleague who will take over your services until you can get back on your feet and provide the high quality services that you normally do. So the code might actually lead you to a solution. And finally, does culture always matter? We believe it does. And we agree that the code has relatively little to say directly on culture. It's only covered in 105 C, D, and E, although these provisions do make it clear that we do have an obligation as behavior analysts to make sure that we have the training to effectively provide services where cultural differences may affect our work. The BACB has also expressly written about the role of culture, albeit in a newsletter. I think it was the May 2016 newsletter, where they discussed gifts, actually, and noted that some cultures may place a premium on receiving gifts and that you may jeopardize your working relationship if you don't accept a gift, and that this is something you need to factor in your decision whether or not to accept that gift. So in the newsletter, they expressly have a role for culture and state that should be taken into your decision-making process. In closing, we wholeheartedly agree with Rosenberg and Schwartz statements that context matters, rules can conflict, and culture always matters. We're grateful for their valuable contributions to this topic, and we believe that every practitioner should be aware of the ethical decision-making model, or at least the considerations behind the model that Rosenberg and Schwartz have brought up. Yet, without minimizing this contribution, we believe that the current code and the rules-based decision-making model is capable of addressing these issues effectively.
All right. Thank you very much, Alan, for the starting points for the opposition. So, Jackie and Diana, I don't know if one of you wants to go next or if you want to tag team again, but this is your chance to elaborate on any of the points that you made in your opening.
I actually agree with everything that you talked about. I think Rosenberg and Schwartz aren't arguing that the ethical code is not helpful and useful for practitioners, right? So I think that's not where they were going. I think that they are just talking that the code is so constrictive that it can't account for all of these very complex situations that happen when we're dealing with people and people that are maybe not like us, right? And so I'm going to actually start with the cultural consideration part of our argument, because the code was written for a society that is not everyone's society. So it was built on, the Western culture that may not be sufficient enough when working with other cultures. And Rosenberg and Schwartz would argue that putting something in a newsletter doesn't really help students when they first look at the code, right? So I don't know any students that are going to go back and collect all of the newsletters from 2015 onward and keep them in a little folder and read them. So I think, the code should stand as its own. And if it says that we can't accept gifts, we can't accept gifts, right? So I think in that way, I think it's going to be difficult for students students of behavior analysis, if the code is a code, it's fairly black and white. If you can't accept gifts, you shouldn't. If you're a small town BCBA and everyone is your neighbor, it's going to be really difficult for you to both adhere to the code and to provide high quality services to your town and community members, right? Because you're going to be violating one of the ethical codes. And you may not do that because you may be fearful that someone is going to report you to the BACB, right? For violation of professional relationships. And so here I think I do agree with you that there is some talk of cultural consideration in the code, just like other codes, but other codes, other ethical guidelines like social work and psychology have a very heavy emphasis on culture. They talk about it very specifically in many, many different areas, almost all areas when they're talking about assessment, when they're talking about treatment. And, I think our code falls by the wayside there when it only mentions it like very minutely, right, in that 1.05. So I think, yes, I agree that that's important that it's there, but I don't think it does enough to help students of behavior analysis to understand that it's a little bit more, right, than what it says there. And so you really need to think about how I think the code as an enforceable rule governed hard black and white issue is not in line with how to teach people to think critically about complex situations. So the Rosenberg and Schwartz article lays out a decision-making model or process that refers to the code, right? And then figures out whether in this specific situation it would be most beneficial to adhere to this one specific code, or would it actually be of a greater harm to the client if I follow the code, right? So if I break laws with a specific cultural norm and I say, oh, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that, and then I break the relationship of the family. And yeah, you can say that the BACB brought that up in the newsletter, but that's not the code, right? That's not the code. The code says we can't do this, and that's just a newsletter. That if you feel that way, then it should be part of the code, and I think the code is a legal document, but I think it fails to take into consideration the complex human relationships that we as behavior analysts interact with on a day-to-day basis. So Rosenberg and Schwartz really highlights the need to teach students to make ethical decisions and to look at ethics as not just black and white. So this should be part of our supervision. It should be part of our training packages. And it should be far beyond just teaching students to follow the code and reading the code. A values-based ethics system would allow us to be more flexible in application to varied situations, as well as adhering to the guidance that the code provides us. So I think incorporating the code into our practice with more opportunities, more flexibility, would actually benefit both clients and our profession as a whole. Diana?
Thank you, Jackie.
You're welcome.
I like everything that you just said. And I think that,
Thanks.
Ultimately, there are many points of overlap for all four of us, right? Where we're going to have a lot of agreement. I think that beautiful flowchart that Rosenberg and Schwartz have prepared is incredibly helpful and is something that should be taught and utilized within the classroom. And I don't think that the other side of the table would disagree with us on that point. However, the issue that we're bringing here is by the current presentation of the code as it stands, it does lay out its points in black and white. And I think Jackie, the point that you're making that the code says don't accept gifts. But then if you go and look in a newsletter, they say, well, maybe there are some times that you can do that. And I feel like that is a little bit hypocritical of the code in that it's asking you to read between the lines and go find the answer in a secondary document that is part of this living, breathing canon that is everything that the BACB considers to be its appropriate guidelines. And it can be really hard to follow and find all of these various points that they have made regarding whether it's ethics or supervision or what have you in various documentation. It should all be listed in one place. And if they are recommending that practitioners do take those types of interpretations, then that should be very clearly stated that we're following this code with those types of additional accommodations, because that can make quite a difference. And as we all know, it's complicated out there attempting to serve families, and there's always a situation that comes up where you're not sure what to do. And then if we all reflect back on what it was like to be a brand new BCBA, you're really not sure what to do. Every situation is new, and you're attempting to sort of build your toolbox of ethical decision making one piece at a time. And once you have a full toolkit, you're better prepared to interpret those situations. But when they're fresh to you, you are really out at sea. And being able to have that experience of knowing how to interpret the code is going to help you in those situations. But if the code is written in such a way that it is presented as these are black and white rules in which all BCBAs need to follow, then there's going to be limitations to how one can interpret those rules. So I agree with you, Jackie, since we're on the same side. That makes perfect sense.
That's good. Rule number one of debate is you have to be on the same side as your partner.
There do need to be some guideposts by which we're establishing the ethics of our field. And as Rosenberg and Schwartz point out at the beginning of their article, it's really, really critical that we as behavior analysts lay out very clearly what the ethics are of our field due to the history of our field. And those need to be bright, shining billboards of ethical points. However, there is gray area and there is room for interpretation. And that's where you bring in a values-based ethics system. So I think that these two things could coexist within the official guidance that's provided to behavior analysts and not requiring them to read between the lines.
All right. Thank you.
And I do want to make one more point.
Your time is up. You cannot.
I am going to anyway, because you can't
point of order.
stop me.
Order, Judge. Point of order. Okay, go for it.
Dr. Karsina brought up the ABA Ethics Hotline that's manned by Dr. John Bailey and his colleagues. And when asked these questions to Dr. John Bailey in multiple workshops, he says you have to follow the code. So he said there are reasons why we have the code and it's written as such. And so if it's written in this way, right, this is the way we have to follow it. So even though there is, discussion that it can be flexible, when asked one of the most esteemed colleagues of the BACB, right, and of ethics in general, who wrote the book and who mans the ethics hotline, that ethics is, it might be dark gray, but as far as he's concerned, how it is written is how it stands.
It's dark gray and cream.
Right? Mother of pearl. Do you remember that commercial about teeth?
I do. I so do. Ecru?
I don't know what that is.
It was like, don't my teeth look so white? And she was like, yeah, they're kind of cream.
Mother of pearl.
Mother of pearl. It was for a toothpaste. Like a whitening
Colgate.
Toothpaste. Yeah.
Colgate whitening.
Oh my God, Jackie and I know a reference that Rob doesn't.
Yes.
Wow. I'm sorry. I don't know where I missed this one.
I'll find it for you.
Well, you guys did great.
Well, that's some docs off your points.
You did great. Yeah, but your reference was no good. And Jackie, you went over time. So negative 1,000,000 points. I'm very sorry. All right. So now it is my turn to go. As the second opposition speaker, do want to go back to some of our main points, really focusing on the area of how the ethical development of a practitioner comes about. Because I think that is very important in discussing what is needed as a field to provide and promote ethical behavior in the long term. So I want to take a moment and I'm going to talk about the skill development of a new practitioner. Whenever we're learning to engage in new repertoires of behavior, any neophyte in the field is going to be first exposed to a written list of steps, or even rules, you might call them. Discussion of these rules, examples of these rules are typically followed by models given to us by experts in the field, those who know better than we do at that time, due to their own experiences. We practice these rules. We get feedback on how well we're following these rules, usually starting in role play situations where there's very little risk of harm to anyone. We follow this up with practice and more feedback in vivo, where the risk, again, while somewhat minimized, does still exist. We expect if we train according to this model, where we set out our rules, we practice them, we discuss them, we try them out, we get feedback, we practice them, discuss them, and on, will allow us to reach a level of mastery in this new skill. So in terms of speaking to the affirmative, why would we for a moment think that learning to engage in an even more complex skill, like, say, maintaining our ethical standards, would occur with anything less than this pattern? Rosenberg and Schwartz state that the primary failing of the BACB ethics code is that the BACB is structuring ethical behavior as a set of rules. But how would a new BCBA comprehend the expansive level of complexity that can stem from maintaining ethical behavior unless the current code were in place as our starting point? Since the ancient Greeks began the discussion of how do humans interact with each other in a fair and just manner, the debate has raged. What is the best way to define our value-based actions? Now, I don't know about you. I'm not, like my esteemed debate partner here, a professor of ethics. And I know I find the discussion of it to leave me, and I'm sure many listeners and many other folks, just really struggling to keep up with what is the best way to promote value-based judgments or ethical behavior in any aspect of our lives, but specifically in our field of behavior analysis. When we start talking about these moral actions, we usually will start with the deontological viewpoint of ethics. If we can follow an agreed upon set of rules, we will all engage in ethical and harmonious behavior, leading to ethical and harmonious outcomes. But we could also be thinking along the lines of, say, Aristotle, an old friend of mine, Aristotle, that virtues are the most important component of ethics. That if we commit to being a good person in all activities, we will be able to appropriately assess the outcomes needed in any context. But each one will require us to carry out a different set of thought processes using a different set of skills. We must weigh these according to our values, our ethical values, in order to come up with a decision. But wait, there's more. What if we decided that it was more important that the ends of our actions justified the means that we use to get there? Such as, say, the utilitarian form of ethics. Now, I'm sure all of you are saying, there are a lot of different ways of ethics. How can we come up with one that is the right answer? And the answer is we can't. Hey, we haven't even gotten into the idea of Western versus Eastern ethics in terms of what is the outcome that we're looking for. Is it harmony among participants? Or is it how did we come to the decisions we made? The practice of ethics is not a spectator sport. Without regular contact with literature, with our colleagues, and with a clear learning structure to follow, what odds do we have that the field of behavior analysis as a whole can allay the fears of our clients that we are truly acting ethically? To this point, there's a long line of helping professions that have chosen to frame their ethical guidelines as a series of rules. Behavior analysts are relative newcomers to the stage. Is it any wonder that the BACB would choose to model our own code similarly? Starting with the 2001 guidelines for responsible conduct for behavior analysts, the BACB has worked to complete step one in the training of ethics in our profession, just setting out the basic expectations of ethical behavior. Given the rapid growth in certified behavior analysts since then, a focus on this rule-based framework in assuring moral interactions in our work with some of the most vulnerable individuals is clearly continued to be called for. But is that enough? According to Rosenberg and Schwartz, perhaps it is not. Is this enough to accommodate the guidance of practitioners in how to respond to ethical dilemmas? Now, While our esteemed colleagues are arguing, and will continue to do so, that the BACB has set forth this code and it is so rigid and it is unmoving, it is trying to be the be-all and end-all of ethics in our field, even sellers writing for the BACB would acknowledge and appreciate that Rosenberg and Schwartz provide further opportunities for our field to continue to generalize the skill of ethical decision-making using their proposed flowchart. The challenge becomes, while Rosenberg and Schwartz might present this model as a more robust alternative to code such as the one the BACB has laid out for us, the BACB would be more likely to categorize it as an extension, something that can capture the facets of ethical decision-making that go well beyond the remit of one single certification board to present to all of its members. As such, this additional scaffolding for BCBAs is very well appreciated, and I think we have all acknowledged it to be such. But a similar thought process has been shared in recent books on how to respond to complex ethical decision-making. Broadhead and colleagues in 2018, Soshin-Nadowski in 2019, both laid out a number of complex ethical scenarios and provided multiple means in which to think through the process using the code. A big difference between these books and the Rosenberg and Schwartz article or argument is that neither of the authors versus Rosenberg and Schwartz took umbrage at the fact that the BACB code was an appropriate starting point for us to begin. Both of these books are recommended for practitioners looking for further practice and feedback in how to improve ethical fluency, especially in ethical conundrums, which are going to change based on a context, including conflicting codes and following with cultural norms. Even older stalwarts of ethics, like Bailey and Birch, see ethics fluency as a process, ongoing practice, stemming from a solid foundation in ethical guidelines that is seasoned with work from other fields. It was originally this work that had such a large impact on the development of these original guidelines. Finally, Rosenberg and Schwartz make a bit of a dubious claim in their overall proposition that the average BCBA possesses the moral knowledge to engage with ethical decision-making without the BACB's foundation of rule-based professional ethics that exists in the current code. As previously mentioned, any skills prior to reaching fluency require a list of steps, or in this case, rules. There's a model, and then further practice with feedback, also required. Well, no one would ever assume that the average BCBA would ever lack the moral will to engage properly with ethics to protect the well-beings of their clients. Assuming a level of moral knowledge fails to capture the difficulty of mastering ethical decision-making. Which of us ethical individuals has never placed files in a less than secure location temporarily or made database decisions without creating a visual representation of our spreadsheet first? How about continuing our work even in the midst of a serious personal crisis or giving advice to a colleague about a client with whom we have no written contract? It is there but for the grace of our professors, our mentors, and our explicit code of ethical conduct that any of us have resolved potential crises like those just mentioned. To start from a base with anything less leaves a generation of professionals struggling to proceed with all the will and none of the way.
Fancy ending.
Thank you. I got -2 points, surprisingly. I don't know how that happened. Jeez.
No, you get +5 for mentioning Aristotle.
I've always been more of a fan of the public speaking component of any debate rather than the actual research. That's hard.
You talk about Plato's cave, you get 10 points.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
All right. So those were our opening statements and sort of our continued discussion of the various points. So now we can get into a little bit more of the back and forth debate, which I think will be, I think this has been fun so far, but possibly even more fun. So we can ask a question. So the affirmative can start. You can ask us a question and then we'll answer it. And then we'll ask you a question and you can answer it.
So how do you think the authors in the BACB would counterclaim the idea that they take culture into consideration where most other professionals have it ingrained in every domain of their ethical code, and it's very explicit that you have to follow, the culture of your client and respect that, whereas the BACB only has it in one place. So please give me a way that students of behavior analysis would know what to do when faced with a difficult cultural situation when they see the code.
All right. So I would like to actually take this opportunity to respond to something you said earlier, but it's related to this, related to the newsletter. People shouldn't be expected to read or know the newsletter, especially students of our profession. And the newsletter is the way that the BACB communicates to all practitioners and anyone who has an account with the website. And it's important that we all read that. And it's important that we as professors or as supervisors make sure that our supervisees are familiar with how the BACB communicates and are also familiar with the newsletters. Furthermore, when it pertains to ethics, the BACB has taken the newsletters that have ethical content and clearly identified those newsletters on their website in the same location or right next to where they have the code itself. So, when you go onto the website and you see the ethics section, you can pull the code down. Then you can see right next to it, oh, here's some newsletters that have relevant information for the code. So I think that's important for people to recognize too, because it's not easy to change a code that serves as a legal document, essentially, without quite a bit of thought and preparation. And I understand the BACB is currently looking at revisions to the code, but it's a process that they need to go through. Sending out a newsletter to clarify something in the code, much easier to do. And, I think we all agree that there's no way that a code can cover everything that it needs to cover. There's just way too many variables that a simple code can't cover. And so you need something like a newsletter to provide some additional information.
Or a more flexible code, you might say, Alan. Just a more flexible code might be able to help you there.
I didn't interrupt you, Jackie.
This is the interrupting part, man.
But I think probably at the end of the day, we agree on a lot more than we disagree.
Yeah.
And that's where I have to point out, I do agree that the code is deficient, in my opinion, in terms of its coverage of culture. Yeah. So it's in there. But given how important that is for practitioners and for all of us, even as, I think when the code was written, the BACB was still meant to certify people internationally. And, we're now on that track anywhere where it's only going to be United States and Canada, I think. But even so, within the United States and Canada, there are so many different cultures that practitioners need to know how to be culturally competent. However, although I agree that that's something that I hope the BACB addresses in the near future and the code incorporates more of, I don't think that the code as written is too rigid or inflexible that we can't work with it as practitioners. I think Rosenberg and Schwartz are overstating their case. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Not a lot, Alan, but I do think the component of even, the Sellers paper and the Sellers response does speak to how the BACB themselves want to take context into account. They even state that is something that will be taken into account when ethics cases are brought before them. So to sort of reiterate Alan's point, it is very easy for us as individual humans with our mercurial ways to decide this Monday, culture matters a lot more than it did last week. Therefore, I think it needs to be taken into account. To then ask for a certification body made up of many individuals representing many other individuals to then shift gear and then immediately place, well, here's our new code that now has all of these other pieces into account. Again, as much as many of us have been in the field for a while now, we are still considered a newer field. So many of the professions that have extensive cultural competent codes probably did not have those when they were at this point in their development, because probably in that point in their development, the idea of cultures other than, the assumed melting pot of American society didn't exist. It wasn't even a component of the discussion. So I think we're trying to move that along. And I think the BACB is trying to make that known, but is also counting on the practitioners to use what's in this code to develop their own ability to work with ethics, to work within that context.
Yeah, and so I just want to bring up a point too, Rob, against what you just said. Not against,
but you can't, Jackie, because it's our turn to ask a question. So you will have to save
but
that
this is so
for
good.
later in the discussion.
But I'm going to forget.
So write it down.
I can't. I don't have things. And when I type, you can hear my typing. Remember? You're like, Jackie, stop typing.
All right.
I just want to highlight that we all agree, but other fields didn't make their ethics codes. They were guidelines until they had all of their stuff in a row. They had all of their cultural considerations, and they had the things in place that they needed as a young field before they made things enforceable, right? So I think we are a young field, and I'm not sure we're quite ready yet to have these enforceable codes when it's harder to be flexible around culture that's not even considered in our code. And we can all agree on that. I mean, it's harder to do.
I would say to that, certainly if we were seeing cases where individuals were bringing up context related to culture to the BACB, and we were seeing, people stripped of licensure, people stripped of certification, the BACB putting out more newsletters saying like, I don't care about culture, or we don't care about culture, then I would be more concerned. However, the fact that has not been their statement, and that there are certainly in situations that they discuss in a published paper to speak to context, I think should put our mind at ease that there is that balancing act of needing to be an enforceable body when we are working with so many individuals who may not be able to protect themselves from a practitioner who is not performing ethically without having it very clearly written what that would be. And we can't expect parents or individuals receiving our services to know what behavior analytic ethics are. If we were to leave it as a framework of decision making, it would put, I think, more in our hands, more power in our hands to say, well, I'm the practitioner, I know what's best for you. Therefore, since my personal value framework says this is ethical, it is, and you can't complain to nobody. So you have to take what I say as law. Having a list of rules that can be compared to is very important. All right. Just want to remind everyone out there that listening to ABA Inside Track, we are ACE approved so that you're able to earn 1 learning credit. And in this case, an ethics learning credit. You're just going to need to listen to the whole episode and then put in these 2 secret code words at our website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs. That's GET-CEUS. And the first of those code words is adjunct, ADJUNCT. Adjunct. That's how to define it too. A word that's hard to spell. Adjunct.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
All right, now it's our turn to ask a question.
Bring it.
Do you believe that without consequences for failure to follow the code, practitioners would follow uniform ethical behavior patterns when working with clients?
Good one.
My answer would be when the code was just a guideline.
Yes or no, Jackie?
It.
I wrote it to be a yes or no question. You have no. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Right. So I think when the code was written prior to 2016, not as an enforceable code, but as a guideline, people were following the ethical code. So I think it's a guideline. It's something that we've learned in our field, and I think guidelines help us.
I think you made the point. It does not necessarily need to exist as a code specifically in order for it to be properly utilized by the practitioners. That if it were a set of guidelines as it was previously, that may be sufficient as far as establishing the ethical parameters in which we need to be operating, but also allow for a little more flexibility in interpretation that is not outside of the realm of what other social services fields use.
I feel compelled to just note that Sellers and colleagues address the language of guidelines versus code. And they state that, yes, I mean, the previous version of the code was called guidelines, but it wasn't meant to be this distinction that Rosenberg and Schwartz make. The reason that they didn't enforce the code as much as they do now is they didn't have the resources that they do now. So, in 2001, when the code first came out, someone brought forth some allegations. They didn't have the people who could investigate it the way that they do now. So they really relied upon, well, if there's something is happening, if there's an insurance company that's being affected and they investigate it, or if it is a state with certification and they investigate it, or whoever might have the capability of investigating and they find proof, then we'll act, right? So it's not that they never found people guilty of violations and enforced the code before 2016. They did. They had a mechanism for doing that. It just wasn't nearly as robust as what they have now. And I think they fixed it or added to it maybe in 2010. But now with the current code, they have more resources and better systems for addressing it. But it wasn't, here's some guidelines, follow them if you want to. And I think when we look at most of the provisions of the code, right, your client's best interest should always be, primary. We're not going to say, well, yeah, that's just a suggestion. I think we all would agree. No, if you don't do this, there should be penalties, right? And, for egregious violations, you should lose your license or your certification. And I think we would agree that in 2004, when it was called guidelines. And, we agree with it just as much now that it's called a code. Although I admit when I first read Rosenberg and Schwartz and they brought up the guidelines and that difference, I found it to be very compelling. I have to agree with Sellers and colleagues that that's probably been overstated as a discussion point.
Rosenberg and colleagues weren't the only people to write about this, though. Broadhead wrote about this, and his colleagues also talked about this issue as well. So it wasn't just them.
Is that a question, Jackie?
Nope, just a comment. I'm really bad at debating, obviously.
All right. Well, now you should ask a question.
I think my question is, if we are in agreement that the code is written from a pretty clear Western privileged perspective, right? And one that values Western culture, and that's permeated throughout the code. So not just the one-off 1.05 about culture, but throughout there are references to that interpretation of how best to serve clients, how best to do as little harm as possible, decision-making regarding discussions of scientific and evidence-based best practice, etc. If we're coming at it from the perspective that is one interpretation of how we should best serve clients, how would you argue without a larger values-based approach to the code that practitioners should best serve clients whose values may be different from that specific Westernized perspective?
That's a really good question, Diana.
What I would say to that is, again, I know that people are looking at revising the code, and I hope some of those considerations are being considered and discussed. But with the current version of the code, there are some provisions that I think don't directly address this, but indirectly do. So the one of the things I like about the code is that the client's interests are paramount, right? So often as a field, we're the experts, and we feel like we know what is best for individuals. And I think the code puts a little bit of a curb on that in the sense that, well, make sure that you have met with your client, that you have really done all the assessments that you need to do, and that you know what they value, right, and what they want from your services. and keeping them informed all the time as you go along to make sure that they're still aware of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and those sorts of things. So I think by placing the interest of the client as primary, this allows us to value different cultural perspectives. So I think it's in there, but it's not as accessible as I would like.
I think to provide sort of a personal example of how a rules-based code was able to sort of override a values-based judgment, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, when I was a newer practitioner of behavior analysis, my first thought was often, I've developed a treatment. It is based on research. It is based on the assessment that I have done. Ergo, it is the correct treatment that will be followed. And it really wasn't until I made it more of a component of my day-to-day thought process of what are the rules, the ethical rules that I should be following as a practitioner, did I actually stop to think that my experience from graduate school, from my mentorship, my supervision, did not trump the needs of the clients I was hoping to serve. And rather than giving me pause and saying, well, these rules are very strict and the way they're written won't take into account culture, won't take into account non-Western philosophies, I found myself spending much more time taking into account the needs of my clients that may not be based in my own background, my own social standing, my own cultural upbringing, much more so than when I first began in the field. So ironically, I think having very stringent rules made me practice a much more meaningful set of cultural values. So again, is that a good debating point or just a personal anecdote? I can't really say, but I thought it was germane to the conversation at this moment.
What concerns me most about devaluing the code, so to speak, and saying, look, here's our ethical decision-making model, follow this, is, and this is right in the ethical decision-making model that Rosenberg and Schwartz have. And I think it's step 1 or 2. It's in one of those early steps where you take a look at yourself and say, oh, do I have any biases that might affect my decision making? Right. So I love that it's in there. And in their example from the article where they have the behavior analyst who's trying to determine, can I provide services to my neighbor who would benefit from that, or should I follow the code strictly and not have that multiple relationship? And the behavior analyst thinks to himself, well, I don't like to follow rules. I know that about myself. So I'll take that in consideration as I weigh the pros and cons, right? My concern is that it's really difficult as an individual to identify and correctly weigh your biases. And for that to be part of the model, what I worry about is that there might be a tendency, or we might see this too often, where individuals don't appropriately weigh their own biases and end up taking a course of action that isn't supported by the code that they justify. So they sort of rationalize. Well, this gift of wine is really, really nice, but this family is extremely wealthy. For them, it's like a $5 gift. So I should be able to accept, not that we accept $5 gifts now anyway, but that kind of rationalization, right? Where you want to do something, the code doesn't allow it, but you can find a way to argue that it's in the best interest of the client. And, that's the slippery slope that comes up so often in ethical discussions. So I guess my question is, how would you maybe safeguard against that? So if you are taking a route or an approach that allows more flexibility, right? That's what this is all about. How would you make sure that it wasn't too flexible?
Before you answer, I just want to say, Alan, amazing job both crafting a question while also completely explaining a huge chunk of the article at the same time. That was beautiful. Mwah, beautiful, beautiful. I'm not biased in my final scores or anything. I'm just...
I would say that I agree with you, because I always do, Alan. Even when I don't think I do, later on I think about it and I do agree with you. But I think here we have to, I think the bias needs to pertain to culture and to look at the culture that our clients are coming from and then make decisions based off of their culture to not harm a relationship with our clients. So if it's customary in a culture to offer tea when you come, right? Make that known, have that be part of the contract, right? So that then we've all discussed what's customary. We're not breaking any rules. We've specified it in the contract. So we're being more flexible by accepting this tea, right? But then outlining specifically when you're going to have tea and when you're not going to have tea, right? To make it part of the framework of how sessions are going to run or how the relationship is going to run. I think that's how we could be more flexible with the code, right? Instead of just saying, nope, we can't have these types of relationships happening. But I mean, the code sometimes reads as if there isn't a relationship, right? And there is, because sometimes people are in someone's home for 7, 8 years, right? And you may not be friends, but you definitely have a different sort of relationship than you would with your doctor that you see for 15 minutes, unfortunately, once a year, right? Your doctor's like, oh, you're great. Like, slap your body, right? Because you are I think behavioral analysts are in a very unique situation because we are in the home. We are with clients for years and years and years. We watch them grow up from babies and, they start driving. Like, I have an old client that just turned 25 and it like kills me because I worked with him when he was in preschool and I'm like, how old am I? Right. But like, it's gross, right? Like, that's I think we are in a unique position, whereas a lot of other professions aren't in this unique position where we are ingrained into people's lives for many, many years and for many, many hours a week. And I think being flexible with that and incorporating it into contracts and incorporating, the boundaries that we can then get a peer review saying, okay, yes, this is acceptable. No, it's not. I think is a way that we could be more flexible when we're dealing with clients in the very intimate way that we do.
All right, so it's time to move into the final section of this debate, which surprisingly is called the Dissemination Station Conclusions. Wow. What are the odds of that happening? All right, so affirmative, you may give your concluding statements first.
We agree on a lot of points that the BACB writes about in their article, and we believe in a lot of the foundational work that is part of the BACB code. But we argue that the BACB code doesn't take into consideration the cultural considerations that we as practitioners face on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour basis. We argue that the BACB code may not consider context in its perceived, I guess, way that we're reading the code, and that sometimes the codes may conflict and it may be difficult for practitioners to choose the better of the codes to follow. And so while we agree that the codes are a necessary foundation for our field, we posit, one might say, that the codes are not as flexible as we need them to be in our everyday practical interactions with our clients.
And then it is the opposition concluding statements. And Alan, as our special guest, wrap up our case.
Some of the things that we would like to close with are that in order to provide both the guidance and the protection that practitioners need, as well as protection for the clients of practitioners and for our field, the ethical code requires a clear set of rules that must be enforced with a fair and transparent process. Furthermore, although teaching a model or process for ethical decision-making should also be taught to practitioners and trained with as many different examples as possible. This is really what you need in order to have an ethical practitioner, someone who both knows what the rules are and is taught how to interpret them and how to implement them. This model doesn't preclude having an enforceable code. It should augment it. Also, making it too easy to disregard a part of the code with given situations, as we discussed earlier, it carries its own risks. Even if you have many practitioners who are very fluent with an ethical decision-making model and make good ethical choices all the time, if you have a small portion of your practitioners that don't, that's going to affect our reputation as a field. It's going to put our clients in danger, and it's something that we need to protect against at all costs. So I think all of us agree that the contributions by Rosenberg and Schwartz are valuable. I really appreciate, as someone who teaches ethics, that it's a great way to start a course, right? It gets students to think critically about things that they might not otherwise do. So I really appreciate them for that contribution. And overall, I really like the model that they came up with, although they point out it's not the model that's important. It's the considerations behind the model. But we do believe that they may have exaggerated their case in terms of the limitations and the constrictiveness of the current code. And that's all I want to say.
All right. Thank you. And that brings us to the end of the great ethics debate. And now I'm going to tally up all the scores here. Let me see.
And Jackie and Diana win.
Jackie and Diana, you guys did great. Very close, but you were the runners up today. I will be receiving a participant ribbon. I'm very excited. And then Alan, you won. You get your trophy will be coming in the mail very, very soon. Congratulations.
Alan did win. Yeah.
This seems a little rigged.
I hated every moment of that.
So debate
but
is
Alan
not
definitely won.
Yeah, Diana, you I think you come from more of an Eastern values of debating, which harmoniousness is more important.
Yes.
Whereas I'm all about the
in
Western
my opening
style.
statement, I wanted to be like, we're actually all on the same side.
But we are.
I know. That's the
Yes.
thing is we actually.
Well, we probably really are, right? When it comes down to it.
Yeah. We're arguing minute details. Good. Nice work. Woo!
When it comes to talking about ethics, because again, the more we talk about ethics as practitioners, the better we will be at understanding and thinking about ethical scenarios so that we can use our code, we can use any other values-based flowchart we want to use to supplement that to make the decisions that are the best for the clients and then therefore for the field as a whole. So I'm so glad we got a chance to talk with all of us together, but it was so nice of you to join us, Alan, to talk about Rosenberg and Schwartz and all of their contributions. Any other points that didn't come up in the debate that you want to bring up before we wrap up today's episode?
I'd love to talk about this for quite a bit longer. There's so many things in preparing for this that came up, but there's nothing that I feel like, oh, we left this out and it needs to be put in. I might think of it later. 3 a.m, I might wake up and say, oh my God, we totally misrepresented John Bailey in the Ethics Hotline.
Which I love, by the way. Everyone should call it.
I remember the first time I wrote to John Bailey and he wrote back like seconds later. It was amazing.
But he's not employed by the BACB.
Nope, he is not.
No, he's not.
Yes, and not everyone loves everything that John Bailey does, so we should put that out there too. But should our BACB be relying on someone who is not even part of it to be interpreting the code for the field?
Right, and it's the ABAI hotline, part of the organization of ABAI.
It's not anymore.
It is again?
No, it wasn't. It was, but then it wasn't. So unless it changed again.
It's linked on the BACB website.
Yes, but that doesn't mean it's part of ABAI though. It's all very confusing.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a little.
Yeah. It was confusing and it definitely is something that has changed over time. I think there might be legal considerations in terms of what the BACB can actually do in terms of recommendations
I'm
for
sure there are.
individuals, because they are the people who, if there was an allegation, would need to process that. They have limitations what they can do. So John Bailey and his colleagues kind of fill a need there. But I agree, it's weird not to have the board be able to be more directly involved.
The hotline is neither the BACB or ABAI. The hotline is the ABA Ethics Hotline, and it says dedicated to independent ethics consultation and guidance. They are ABA professionals that include a variety of ABA professionals in the field.
At the end of the day, when it comes to ethics, you need to know your code, but there are going to be other contexts that have to be taken into account, which is the reason that we continue to need CEs specifically in the area of ethics because it is so complex. You can't just learn the code. I learned that in grad school, 10 years ago, and I'll just go about my day and I'll never think about it again and assume I'm doing everything right because I'm a good person. And I think as we've learned in a lot of our conversations where we've been talking about culture, we've been talking about race, there are a lot of areas in our lives where just being a good person does not substitute for critical thinking and professional and personal development. So
yeah, I think that's well stated. And our field is continuing to develop in this aspect. And you'd be hard pressed to find someone who didn't say, yeah, I think that we should be updating our approach. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true for the BACB as well, because they're considering ways in which they might further define some of these components that aren't readily present. So I eagerly anticipate another version.
Someday. Within our lifetimes, we'll definitely see another update. Hopefully not too long in our lifetime.
So one thing I'm thankful for, and this goes back to Rosenberg and Schwartz, is that they introduced me to Rushworth Kidder. He was an ethicist who founded the Institute for Global Ethics. And a lot of their ideas are taken from his work. He has a book, How Good People Make Tough Choices, Resolving the Dilemmas of Ethical Living. And a lot of what Rosenberg and Schwartz reference, you can see the origins in Rushworth Kidder's work. So I would recommend, if people have an interest in ethics, and this topic in particular, in terms of how do I make ethical decisions, it's an excellent book. He's not a behavior analyst, but he's someone who spent most of his life dealing with practical ethics in the business world and has some really good perspectives on that.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for joining us again for, I think, an exciting episode, a little shift in format, but I think we still covered what we always do, which is discuss behavior analytic research. So thank you so much for suggesting these articles, this topic, and this format. It was a fun way to explore our own thoughts on ethics and the research. So thank you.
Well, it was great to see all of you again.
Before we go, I want to make sure to do some final thanks to everyone. I want to say thank you to all the listeners out there. We hope you enjoyed this episode of ABA Inside Track. If you did, why not subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. There are a lot of other ways that you can reach out to the show, certainly through social media. We're on Pinterest, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as ABA Inside Track. You can find these episodes posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature enabled. You can, of course, go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can find the links to all of these articles, as well as links to purchase continuing education credits. If you're interested in hearing even more shows or in interacting with us more, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Also, it'd be remiss if I didn't say big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, to Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, to Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work, and Hollis Irvin from the Sycamore Workshop for his visual design work. So before we go, I want to make sure everyone gets that second secret code word. It is RESPECT, RESPECT. You can find out what it means to us by listening to the preceding episode and future episodes, I suppose. That's RESPECT. All right. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But back to our normal format, I think, Dinah. Unless you really want to do more debates, Dinah. Just every podcast a debate from here on out?
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll be back next week with our normal format of episodes. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.